Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. I don't want to cause eerie flashbacks of empty streets and life reduced to Zoom calls and short, socially distanced walks, and the albino gorilla honking at you from Downing Street. But as the COVID inquiry gives its verdict tonight on the politics of the pandemic, a few thoughts. Boris Johnson made serious mistakes. He could be wild, heedless and idiosyncratic, and also sexist. The inquiry has found that he oversaw a toxic and chaotic culture in which the loudest voices prevailed and the views of other colleagues, particularly women, often went ignored. That sounds about right. But these were horrendously difficult decisions made at speed with patchy information, and I'm not absolutely sure that other political leaders, John Major, say, or Jeremy Corbyn, Keir Starmer or Theresa May, would have done spectacularly better. They might have acted more quickly. They wouldn't have partied in Downing Street when the rest of us were in such a diminished condition. But, they'd probably have made other and different mistakes. Revisiting the fear, the loneliness, the care home deaths and the political embarrassments of those years is only worthwhile if we learn lessons. Researchers suggest there is a real risk of another pandemic. Have we grown wiser? Would we do better? Well, let's start tonight with our reporter Fraser Knight, who's been combing through the details of this report all day. Fraser, I mentioned there the very strong criticisms of Boris Johnson, but what are the essential lessons do you think a future government could learn from this report?
There are so many lessons in here, Andrew, and a reminder, this is just report number 2 of 10 to come from the COVID inquiry, but lots in there around, again, that culture in Downing Street about listening to different voices or not, about the relationship with devolved nations, the poor trust that they had between Boris Johnson and the First Ministers, for example. This report says meant that he didn't include them in a lot of the key UK government decision-making. You'll remember, of course, it all sort of fell to Michael Gove to hold up those relationships through the pandemic. And, of course, around how those discussions were being had right at the heart of government on WhatsApp. Many of those messages that we know also don't exist anymore, slammed by this report.
And when it comes to action, the essential lesson, too little, too late.
Too little, too late. The virus wasn't taken seriously enough at the start, is what Baroness Heather Hallett has said. In fact, she said that the first lockdown came 1 week too late. And if it had been implemented a week earlier, could have saved 23,000 lives in England alone. And that is a theme that we saw throughout the pandemic, she says, where actually the decision-making was slow. Boris Johnson, she said, kept changing his mind on whether he agreed with the advice that he was being given or not.
And in terms of the way government actually happens in this country, very serious criticisms about WhatsApp.
Indeed, a lot of the messages that were used during COVID to have those discussions and indeed to even make some of those decisions, because it was on WhatsApp, Baroness Hallett says a lot of them don't exist. And since COVID, of course, we've seen a changing in the policies around, I think it's the Scottish Government have said that they no longer want to use WhatsApp at all. There was also a period where it was, if you send a message, delete it as soon as you don't need it anymore. So it wasn't being, retained in the way that they probably should.
You can see why an inquiry would be very frustrated by that phrase. Thank you very, very much indeed. Because also here in the studio, I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Fong, who is the National Clinical Advisor on Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response for NHS England during the COVID. And you gave some very emotional and interesting evidence to the inquiry yourself, Kevin. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, I said at the beginning of the programme, there's no point in any of this unless we learn lessons. So from what you have seen, what do you think are the crucial lessons that you learned from this?
Well, in this module, I think you're hearing about the need for decisive and fast action. And that is the lesson that goes forwards to all future leaders of this and other countries, that you have to have some humility in the face of a pandemic.
If there's a pandemic, move very quickly.
Well, as Sir Patrick Vallance said, you need to operate your restrictions faster and harder and earlier than you would like, confronted by something that has an exponential growth of this kind. And I think that was part of the error here, was to underestimate just how fast you would find yourself underneath this thing. And so the problem is that for a political leader, you need to make decisions and make actions before it's obvious to the man or woman in the street. And that takes leadership and that takes courage and the speed that is referred to in the report.
And it might take not listening to colleagues too much for too long, therefore.
Yeah, it is about understanding that the preparedness phase, which Module 1 tells us that we weren't particularly prepared for this, we were underprepared for this. If you then make contact with the pandemic at that point, and what essentially the Module 2 report says is that you've abandoned the precautionary principle. You've said, I don't really think that the reasonable worst-case scenario is something we need to prepare for. Then all you have left after that is containment. And if your policies of containment, if your strategies of containment are no good, then you're done.
You've only got the brake pedal. Because I'm really interested, there is another entirely different line of attack on the way the pandemic was handled, which is all those people who say, do you know what, the lockdown was too fierce, too long, it's damaged a generation of children in ways that we should have thought more about at the time. And, it's damaged business. We've never really recovered economically. And actually, it's the opposite in the sense of what we've been talking about.
Well, so I think the thing to get away from in this and all future responses is it's not about whether you let people run riots or lock them down forever. There is between those 2 points, not a point, but a complex plane of solution that you have to find. And that takes agility in government, that takes deference to expertise wherever it lies in the system, and that takes, the speed and agility that was mentioned by Baroness Hallett at the start of her report.
Because the things that I thought went quite well were certainly aspects of the communication strategy. You would see the government and you'd see the chief scientific advisor, you'd see epidemiologists up there on the platform, and we got used to listening to scientific advice alongside political advice.
Yes, I think many things went well, and there are things that went well, there are things that went badly. You have to greet those with equanimity when you're learning the lessons. Absolutely, I think the chief scientific advisor and chief medical officer we had, and their deputies, we were very, very lucky. The vaccine rollout, a masterclass in how to do that. And from my point of view, the response of my colleagues in the National Health Service is itself a masterclass on how you take an organisation of 1.5 million people and pivot to face something it's never designed to face.
You spoke very movingly to the inquiry about the pressures and the experience of working on the front line at the time. How do you think people from the NHS will be feeling tonight when they hear that figure of 23,000 lives might have been saved with a faster lockdown?
It will be difficult for them to hear that. The problem for the NHS workforce, the frontline teams, is that whatever decisions are made, in central government, they have to field the consequences of them. And I think tonight they'll probably be feeling like if different decisions were made, they perhaps would have had to absorb less.
You've been the preparedness guy. There will probably be some other pandemic at some point. Do you think we will be better ready for that than we were this time around?
So I really hope so, because this is our only opportunity to learn these hard-won lessons. And these lessons are written in people's blood. And if we ignore them, if we fail to pay attention to this inquiry, I know it's been long, but it has to be long. We have to pay attention to this, because our only opportunity to escape to a better future is to learn the lessons that are laid out in this module and the modules that follow it. We owe it to people, we owe it to everyone who lost so much in so many different ways to be better next time. And that means being honest about where we were good, where we were less good, where we made massive errors, and just go forwards with a better preparedness strategy and a better response.
I think that is the single most important reflection on what's happened today. Dr. Kevin Fong, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to me. Now, Boris Johnson isn't, of course, here to speak for himself tonight, but there are serious allegations, as we've heard, that have been levelled against him. So I wanted to talk to somebody who's not just a close friend of the Prime Minister, but was also a health minister in Number 10 during the pandemic, Nadine Dorries. Does she think that this report is an accurate reflection of Johnson's government?
No, and I'm going to say that really as a defence of the government, as much as a defence of Boris Johnson. What I can tell you is that every decision that was taken with huge debate, discussion, both with officials, number 10 officials, Department of Health officials, Public Health England officials, as they were at the time, SAGE. There was, the layers of debate and discussion and information gathering that went on were huge. And there was a very important reason for that. And that was because the decisions that were being taken were hugely impactful upon everybody and had massive consequences potentially massive consequences if they were the wrong decision. Boris Johnson was not an epidemiologist. I was a former nurse, but I was not a doctor. I was not an epidemiologist. Neither was any other health minister at the time. We relied, firstly, on the advice of both Dr. Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer. Then we relied upon the advice from SAGE and others who were drafted in hurriedly at the outbreak of COVID to provide expert analysis on what was taking place. Now, the decisions that were taken were based on the facts and the evidence presented to the government, the department, then to the government, then to the Prime Minister. They were not based on an individual assessment of any one person. No one person was ever involved in a single decision.
Now, clearly everybody, not just the British government, all governments had imperfect information. Nobody had all the facts at the time. But there is a view of Boris Johnson that he is a bit sort of heedless and libertarian and was very, very reluctant to move early because of the effect on the country. And there's a counter-argument that actually the lockdown was too fierce and damaged too many children and so on. You're getting it from both sides. But just tell me a little bit about how you think his character and his political philosophy affected the way he handled this.
Well, I saw him, I think, at his best at that time. So, there's a reason why this country got the first vaccinations into arms. And it's the reason why this country was the first to come out of lockdown. And it was because Boris Johnson personally picked up the telephone to vice chancellors of Oxford University, of AstraZeneca. He pleaded with those research and drug companies not to take the vaccine to the US, to fund it here in the UK, to manufacture it here in the UK. I saw the 18 hours a day that he was putting in to make that happen. And I find these criticisms, probably coming from, his enemies, of which he has many. But I do wish with something like this, who knows when we'll face another pandemic, the next virus will come around the corner. I do wish people, rather than putting their political interests first and constantly attacking Boris Johnson because he delivered Brexit, that's the reason why he was taken down as the Prime Minister. I do wish people would actually put the country first when they're thinking about making these attacks. Now, obviously, that's, as you've just informed me, I haven't seen it today, was in the COVID report. That COVID report was informed by many people giving information, including Dominic Cummings, who was a bad actor throughout. He's the guy who went to Barnard Castle. He was a bad actor throughout COVID. So I really do wish that people would think about putting the country first before they attack. Play the ball rather than the man, because it really is vitally important that they do that.
And you mentioned Dominic Cummings there, Nadine. The report criticises what they call his destabilising behaviour throughout this and says that Boris Johnson rather encouraged that.
No, he did not encourage it. It's the reason why Boris Johnson sacked Dominic Cummings. It was not just Dominic Cummings, there were others, people within number 10 who were answering directly to Dominic Cummings, his head of communications, Lee Kane. There were many others who should have been focused on the government business of the day, who should have been focused on COVID and what was happening, and were actually not doing so. And so I think that the criticisms of Dominic Cummings are correct. Boris Johnson sacked Dominic Cummings. Reason why he did so.
And final obvious question, really, because it implies that there was a kind of element of sexism and he wasn't very good at listening to women. Now, as one of the most prominent women in the government, what do you say to that?
It's absolute total nonsense. I think actually there's a possibility that Boris Johnson listened at that time. And I'm here defending both, him at the time, but also the government. And I do find these accusations that are levelled at prime ministers. I've had similar things said about Keir Starmer. I've had similar things said about other party leaders like Nigel Farage. I heard it said about David Cameron. And I think it's a really easy criticism to level at a party leader. But what I'd say was provide the evidence, because I never saw it. Did David Cameron have an issue with women? I think possibly. He had, an uncomfortable relationship with older women. I don't know why that was, but did that stop him listening to women? No. You can see that he promoted a lot of women and took a lot of advice from women. Does Keir Starmer have trouble listening to women? I don't think so. No more than Boris Johnson did or Nigel Farage will. What they're interested in is the data, the information, the evidence, because their careers, the future of their parties, whether they win elections or not and get their particular agendas and manifestos forward, depend on having the best people advising them. And not one of those men is stupid enough to think to himself, well, I'm not going to take the advice from that person because she's a woman, even though it may be the best advice of the day. And it certainly wasn't true with Boris Johnson, throughout my 2 years as a health minister, throughout my year as a Secretary of State. And I can also say this, if I may, it has not been my experience with Nigel Farage, who asks for advice when it is appropriate. So I just think it's a nonsense for people to level those accusations. And I think it's a very easy one to level. And what I would say to people who are repeating it is, where is the evidence?
Well, listen, it's been impossible to get Boris Johnson to defend himself tonight. I'm really glad you came on. I know you've had a very, very busy day indeed. So Nadine Dorries, thanks so much for that.
You're welcome, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Coming up, the new Home Secretary has announced a massive overhaul of the migration system that's going to affect millions of people living today in the UK. I'll discuss the changes with a Home Office Minister next, but the time now 6:18.
Night with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:20. If you're a migrant who arrived in this country after Brexit, part of the so-called Boris wave of migrants, then you're going to have to wait longer than you thought to get settled status to stay here. Shabana Mahmood, Britain's new hardline Home Secretary, said that the normal qualifying time will double from 5 to 10 years. You can speed the process up by working in the NHS or being a higher earner or entrepreneur. On the other hand, if you're low paid and you come here on a health and social care visa, it'll be a 15-year wait. And if you rely on benefits, you won't get settlement for 20 years. If you came here illegally, 30 years. This is a much tougher system for what has become a much less welcoming country. Let's hear now from our political correspondent, Aggie Chambry. Aggie, second day that Shabana Mahmood has faced the Commons with very, very tough messages, and she seems to, in terms of the chamber, have sort of sailed through.
Indeed she does. I have to say, the chamber was much less full than I expected it to be today, but she definitely faced less opposition today than she did on Monday when she announced those big hardline measures and changes to the asylum system. The Conservative benches too were much sparser than they were on Monday, and actually I don't think Reform UK were there at all. But the big announcements were, as you just laid out there, that these will affect almost 2 million migrants who arrived in the UK from 2021. And I think it's worth looking at the health and social care visas. So some 616,000 people and their dependents came on these between 2022 and 2024.
So we're talking about more than 1 million people, probably.
Indeed, and they are now subject to a 15-year baseline. Now, that scheme the route has now been closed because of what the government describes as widespread abuse, but it might not be 15 years. So, for example, if you were on that scheme expecting to get ILR, indefinite leave to remain, in 5 years, you're now waiting 15 years, but if you've claimed benefits for more than a year, then you could well be waiting 25 years. Now, there is still a consultation going on. We don't know that this will actually go through, although actually this is one of the things I'm told that does not need primary legislation, so it looks likely to.
Just hovering over that matter of the health and social care visas, I have heard from MPs complaints that a lot of people come into their constituencies on those visas and are involved in criminality or drugs gangs within days.
I think that is one of the things that MPs and indeed government ministers have been very worried about. And that's why in July 2025, they said no social care visas would now be issued to new applicants from abroad. And before that, they'd actually already said that overseas care workers couldn't bring dependents. But I think there was a big worry about this. And that is one of the reasons why those numbers that you laid out at the beginning, that so-called Boris wave, were so high.
Really, really interesting, Aggie. Thanks so much for that. I'm joined now by the Migration Minister, Mike Tapp. Mike, just let's start with that business of the care and social care visa, because clearly we need people to do these jobs. They're one of the things that we need. We have a great need for people, and yet there seems to be a widespread belief, certainly in your department, that these have been particularly misrepresented or used badly.
They have, unfortunately, and Aggie gave the number there that 616,000 came in on that visa. That was to fill just 40,000 jobs, and I think that speaks volumes. Now,
so if there were 40,000 jobs, how is it allowed that so many people got the visas?
Well, this is what we call the Boris wave, where it was an open border experiment that completely failed. And
kind of crackers, isn't it?
It's just an absolute failure that we've now got to put the brakes on and fix, because unfortunately, if we carry on down this route, then 1.6 million individuals will have access to benefits and housing by 2030. That's unsustainable, and we've got to regain that control and order to the system. Now, I've been out with LBC actually on immigration enforcement visits where we've met individuals who are here on social health and social care visas, but have never worked in that sector because there's a dodgy sponsor, and are actually working in cash in hand car washes, for example.
I suppose philosophically the big problem with this proposal is that for the first time that I can remember, the British government is grading people about how valuable or useful they are. In other words, if you're an entrepreneur, you're in one category, or you're in one box, and so on. It goes down and down and down until you're on benefits, as if the entire group of people who immigrated here can be sorted into different boxes. And that's a strange thing for a government that thinks of itself as egalitarian or on the left to be doing.
Well, there's always different routes to the country, so of course you have to categorise. I think there's over 70 different routes, by the way, which is a lot. But this isn't about categorising them as people. They're decent people. It's about making sure that
decent people we don't want so much. We don't want you. We do want you.
It's an unsustainable level of migration that's having too much of putting too much pressure on our public services and, of course, the welfare system. So by retaining that or restoring that control and order, it means that the British people can have faith in the asylum system. And actually what that does is it takes away a tool of the right to sow division, so we can unite again as a country, because that's what we deserve. That's what the people want. That's what we'll deliver.
OK, let me just hover over this again. I am, shall we say, someone who's come in on a social care visa, and then in a couple of years' time, I actually get a job that's higher paying, and maybe I start my own company. And at each point in my life, I'm going to be assessed by the Home Office in terms of how long it's going to take before I have the leave to stay here permanently. Is the Home Office actually capable of doing this? The Home Office is very bad at lots of things. It's not the most effective department in government. It's a really huge new job it's giving itself.
Well, this is where the leadership of myself, of the Home Secretary, of Alex Norris is really important to ensure that the staff and are processing to the right levels. And already we've seen in the last year and a half a 50% increase in that processing of asylum seekers, for example. So we can do it, and we're really confident we can deliver this.
What about the sort of psychological effect on people of this new measure? Because, you want people to come here, put down roots, be good citizens, perhaps build businesses, employ people, and all the rest of it, think about themselves being here for the next 20 or 30 years. If they're suddenly thinking, well, I might be picked up and removed at some point in my life, then they're going to be less likely to do the things that we want them to do in this country. They're going to be less settled, less integrated, and less sure of their own futures.
I'd say quite the opposite, actually, Andrew. I think if there's incentives to integrate and contribute, then you're more likely to. Clearly, the current system isn't working, and that's why we are seeing division in our communities. It's often migrants who go to their MPs and, bring up the fact that there's visa abuse, etc. So across all communities, this is having an impact. By restoring that control and order, then we can unite again as a country. And at the moment, that's simply not happening.
You sit day in, day out with Shabana Mahmood. You know, you listen to her across the table debating these points inside government. Is she a future leader of your party?
I'm immensely impressed by Shabana Mahmood. I think she will go down in history as one of the finest Home Secs, if not the finest. Of course,
She's
we've got to deliver.
She's only just got going.
Of course, we've got to deliver on these policies, and I'm fully behind her. And she will and is a fantastic Home Secretary.
So, in any leadership contest, she's got your vote.
Well, I'm not going to. I think I'm well and truly behind Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. Yeah, he's only had 18 months already. We're starting to deliver, but there's of course a hell of a lot of work to do.
Hell of a lot. It's been a very, very bad few weeks for the government. You've had a better week because you've been talking about migration and the party hasn't split, as many people thought it might on this issue, at least so far. But what about the tensions inside Number 10? As a minister, do you think that this government is being properly run from the centre and by the centre? Because clearly there are real problems.
Well, firstly, on my colleagues who I've spoken to about our measures this week, they get it. They understand that that's what they're hearing on the doors, and the fact that there's that fairness and compassion in there too, which is really important because we're
not
firm
a huge
but fair.
amount.
Oh, well, there is. We are firm but fair, and by bringing back control, it's fair to people in the country, and MPs do understand that. On Number 10, all I can say is what I've seen, and for me, it's been very professional. I was listened to on the backbenches, and I have no issues there at all.
OK. Talking about Number 10 and how it operates, what's your reaction to the report from the COVID inquiry today?
I'm going to be honest with you, Andrew. I've been in a backbench debate until I came on this show, but I have had a quick look. I can see that there's some pretty hard words against the previous government. Now it's about taking stock, ensuring that we learn the lessons from those failures and making sure they are not repeated in the future.
Do you believe that if Keir Starmer had to face a pandemic, he'd do better?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about that. I think he's a man of detail, and that's what's needed in these sort of situations.
All right, Mike Tapp, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to us. Up next, a secret meeting between Russian and American officials has led to a so-called peace plan for Ukraine, including many concessions. Does it mean that Russia has now, in effect, won? Time now 6:30, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
With Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
There is heroism still left on this planet. Perhaps 500,000 Ukrainians have been killed defending their country against the vastly bigger Russian military machine. Vladimir Putin thought he'd finish them off in a few days, or at the most a couple of weeks. More than 3.5 years later, they are still fighting desperately, doggedly against terrible odds. 1,366 days. Young men, young women, teachers, computer scientists, taxi drivers, novelists, blown to pieces, shredded by shells, maimed and dying in agony, or being patched up and hobbling back to the front line to fight some more. Busy industrial towns and charming villages turned into black mush, the skies full of killer drones, roads crammed with ambulances, and overnight, another 26 people, including 3 children, killed. Why say all of this now? Because tonight it rather feels as if Ukraine is being betrayed. The latest so-called peace deal from people around Donald Trump, which would involve the country giving up half of its armed forces and its long-range missiles, surrendering its frontline defences, including land it still controls, agreeing to a ban on all Western European troops on its soil, and instituting Russian as an official language, was rightly described in Paris as a plan for capitulation. Bluntly, if this was imposed, the Americans would be stabbing Ukraine in the back. If a surrender was forced, it would finish President Zelensky and plunge his country into political turmoil. Ukraine, underestimated so many times, may well keep going and win a better deal. But this plan would mean Russia has won this war, and a massive defeat both for democracy and Ukraine's heroes. So what's really going on here? I spoke to Kurt Volker, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, and I put it to him that this plan was really capitulation.
It's clearly not going to be accepted by the Ukrainians or by Europeans. It is basically taking Russia's position and putting it down on paper. Imagine, it's the equivalent of sitting down with Hamas and coming up with a peace plan and then telling Israel to just implement it. Simply not going to happen.
Yet, Steve Witkoff obviously takes it seriously. He's had his conversations with the Russians, and it is therefore presumably being taken seriously inside the White House. So what happens next?
Well, we don't know that for sure. You're right that he's been given the leash to go ahead and give it a try, see what happens. But we haven't heard President Trump talk about this at all. It's not clear that President Trump wants to be behind this and has given himself a little room to walk away. Likewise, we have not heard that President Putin is prepared to agree to peace, even if this were agreed. In fact, the Kremlin spokesperson, Peskov, said that there is no peace plan. So I think that this is a lot of maybe very sincere wishful thinking, but not anything that is really going to be implemented or have any impact on this war.
I suppose we should be careful of always assuming there is a plan behind everything or a cunning plan behind everything. But if there was, it might be part of further attempts to destabilize Zelensky, push him off his previous positions and persuade him to take something not quite as bad as this.
Yeah, well, if you think about that, it would have the opposite effect. I think it is fair to say that the Ukrainian people are very upset at President Zelensky and the government because of this recent corruption scandal. But if President Zelensky were then to take a further step and give away territory to Ukraine and limit the size of the Ukrainian military, that's going to make the public even more upset. It's not going to relieve any pressure, but would increase it. So it's self-contradictory in a way to think that now's the time to tell Zelensky to do something that would be vastly unpopular because he's unpopular already.
Well, maybe I'm being too conspiratorial, but I wonder if part of certainly the Russian thinking is push Zelensky so hard that eventually there is some kind of political collapse in Ukraine, which the Russians could then in turn exploit.
Well, the Russians may indeed be doing that. They would love to see Zelensky go. They keep referring to him as a Nazi and the government as a Nazi regime. So they're all about regime change in Ukraine. But the fact is that the Ukrainian people, while unhappy, they know that they are in a life or death struggle and they've got to stick together and win. They are going to stick with Zelensky and they're going to stick with the military and they're going to stick with the defense of the homeland for as long as they possibly can, because they don't have any other choice.
And I'd love to hear, Ambassador, your assessment of what's really going on, because there have been reports that from the front line, Ukrainians are starting to pull back. It's just too much, and they're unable to hold positions, that the Russians, this great meat grinder, is grinding slowly on, and it's all downhill, really, for Kyiv.
Well, yes and no. Yes, that meat grinder is grinding on. The Russians have indeed changed some of their tactics as well, so they're not losing 1,500 people a day, maybe only 700 or 800 people a day. So they are losing a bit fewer. But that being said, they are making minor gains. But in many places around the front line, a few kilometers here, a few kilometers there, they keep putting pressure on this town of Pokrovsk that we've been hearing about for 18 months. They may well take that town. They may make further gains. This is not the same as Ukraine just losing the war, pulling back, being defeated. These are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Kyiv. They don't necessarily lead to the next phase of Russia taking over territory. Russia will have to fight for every inch, and I don't see that this is really making a strategic difference. Likewise, the Russian attacks overnight on Ukrainian cities and civilians and heating and electricity and so forth, very damaging, very painful for Ukrainians, causing a lot of hardship, but it's not going to make a strategic difference in the war. Ukraine is still going to fight, and the Ukrainians are on their own having some success hitting deep inside Russia, their refineries, their oil pipelines, trying to bring war home to the Russian people a little bit.
Are there things Western European members of NATO should be doing that we're not?
Well, I think it's all a question of speed and scale. I think that Europe is doing a lot. They have committed to provide 5% of GDP on defense, to buy American weapons and ammunition, send them to Ukraine, to buy other sorts of ammunition, send that to Ukraine, deploy a coalition of the willing once there's a ceasefire. I think that all of this needs to be accelerated. Europe should, for example, seize the frozen Russian assets, create a fund that is available to support Ukraine for a couple more years. The coalition of the willing could begin plans for deployment now. We could be integrating Ukraine's air defense system with NATO air defense system so that we are providing integrated coverage and protection for NATO populations that adjoin Ukraine while Ukraine takes care of its population. There's a lot of things that we could be doing faster and at a greater scale than we're doing, but all the movement by Europe is in the right direction.
Finally, there's been a suggestion that in due course the Germans should take over effective leadership of NATO inside Western Europe from the Americans. That's been a suggestion coming from Washington. I wonder what your opinion would be about that.
Well, I don't think that is going to be very popular in Europe for Germany now all of a sudden to be in charge of everything for security. And Germany itself has had a strong pacifist streak ever since the defeat in World War II and then the Cold War. So I don't think that Germany has shown a tradition of putting in place the capabilities needed to deter aggression and defeat aggression if it occurs. It's always been much more about accommodation. So I think there does need to be greater European leadership within NATO, but I think it's going to come from a coalition of countries, including Poland, Italy, Germany, France, the UK.
So let's hope this so-called peace plan somehow vanishes into the mists of the winter and isn't heard of again.
I suspect it'll fizzle. I do suspect it'll just fizzle and we'll be right where we've been for many months now.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC today.
Thank you.
Ambassador Kurt Volker there. Now, yesterday we were talking about the possibility of an AI-generated stock market bubble suddenly bursting with terrible consequences. A lot of that hung on the reported profits of a single company, Nvidia, announced after we were off air. So in the interests of being open and also cheering you up, it's good to report that Nvidia, the chip maker, which is now the world's largest company, did even better than expected. Perhaps one day that bubble will burst, but it won't be today. Let's talk to LBC's technology correspondent, Will Guyatt. Will, for the uninitiated, just explain why Nvidia is such an absolutely pivotal company, not just the world's biggest, but one of the world's most important.
So Nvidia have been around for about 30 years, Andrew, and originally they were making high-powered graphics cards for computer games, so PC games. Gamers wanted better graphics, and it was a company that developed those services. It turns out that those GPUs, the cards you put into your PC, are incredibly good at computing all the mathematical stuff that goes behind artificial intelligence. So when you're building artificial intelligence models, or you're running huge amounts of data through these servers in the cloud, which you and I have talked about, and the cloud is really a warehouse somewhere with a load of computers in it, all of those computers have to have these GPU cards in them. So it's technology that was developed for gaming that's now pretty much, give or take a few tweaks, being used in these computers. And they're so popular, what's actually happening with many companies like Meta, back in the old days when oil companies used to predict how many barrels they were going to get out of the ground, these companies like Meta are now saying in their annual report, forward-looking, how many GPUs they are able to obtain from Nvidia. Because the company's cards are so popular, there's a real demand driving sales. And this is a strange example of a company not overcooking itself, but the analysts and investors in the city
getting
really excited about the company. The company has always been very, very, very careful about what it creates. It creates fine products. It's not hyping itself up like an OpenAI or an Elon Musk with Tesla, for example. But what comes from this is they may actually eventually undersell, or they can't make as many as they think demand is. And a number which has been predicted by somebody who has no inside knowledge of what the company is selling will impact whether or not the company is worth what other people think the company is worth. That's the strange situation we find ourselves in.
And well, I read that it is responsible for about 90% of the tech behind AI, which is an astonishing figure. But the other thing that perhaps concerns people is the way that these relatively small number of huge huge AI companies are all kind of interlocking or almost mating with each other. So we had a big deal the other day with Nvidia, Microsoft, and Anthropic, all not merging, but kind of grappling each other, which means that the whole system, I mean, if one of these big companies goes down, perhaps they all do.
Huge announcement yesterday in Saudi Arabia. There's going to be a massive data center. Elon Musk's X is going to be the first customer, and Nvidia are putting their cards into every one of, I think, the 50,000 plus computers in that server space. So yeah, they are all interconnected. They do all rely currently on Nvidia. What might happen though, Andrew, over time, if this demand stays up, other companies like Intel and other tech companies will try and do something to make better cards that can compete with what Nvidia have got. Nvidia design great products. They've got here slightly by accident, and I don't mean that they didn't. They've always created good products, and they've worked for a different function that they weren't originally intended for, and that's why they've been super popular.
It is a really extraordinary thing. Our world is being changed by AI very, very fast. We're living through this extraordinary revolution. But the cards, the GPUs responsible from it, were originally designed sort of for shooting games and better coloured clouds and, men with axes running around on our television screens.
Yeah, it's slightly simplified, but yes, give or take the technology there. If you stuck a socket on the end of one of these cards that are used that currently can cost up to £60,000 per piece, it would play video games. But it's a far more powerful version of what is originally in those systems. But yeah, it's a company that's become hugely successful, and the weight of expectation must be on their shoulders because they keep having to create cards for companies to buy. They also have to keep getting the silicon and everything in order to keep up with demand. So it must keep Jensen Huang, the boss of the company, who's never seen without his leather jacket, I must say, up at night.
It must. Are you concerned at all that the link-ups between a relatively small number of monster-sized AI companies and Nvidia and so on is dangerous? In other words, is there a fragility in this system, or are we just living through an era of AI industrialization around the world, which is going to completely dominate and change our lives, and we better get used to it and stop worrying about bubbles bursting?
Well, the challenge we face, let's not forget, we've had massive internet outages that continue. We had another one yesterday. And when you've got a few players in a market like this and the number is dwindling, you're going to get more outage and less resilience. And that is the challenge. If all the eggs are in the basket, let's say like a year or so ago when there was an accidental update to the Windows platform that caused huge technical problems for computers. If Nvidia accidentally send an update to all of these graphics cards, these GPU cards in processing, it might not take everything out of action instantly, but it could cause a huge disruption in the same way as we've had issues with, the internet via the domain name system failure. So yeah, absolutely possible.
Both very big and quite fragile. Will Guyatt, thank you very much indeed. I was talking about Nvidia, not you. In a few moments, I'll be joined by my political panel to discuss the highly controversial reforms to migration this week, as well as the impending budget and reports of possible dissent from the Labour backbenches. But the time now, 6:48.
LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:50. What a week it's been. Mind you, I could say that almost every week at the moment. Time to reflect on this one now with two experienced colleagues, Jenni Russell, political columnist at The Times, and Claire Ellicott, the Whitehall editor of the Daily Mail. Welcome to you both. Let's start today with Shabana Mahmood, our kind of RoboCop Home Secretary, who seems to be winning plaudits right across the world, right across the political world, except perhaps on the left of her own party. Jenni.
Thank goodness for Shabana Mahmood. I mean, if somebody doesn't grasp the problem with the Boris way of having brought millions of people who are mostly low-paid or unskilled or dependents into this country over the past 4 years, thus enraging the population, then Reform will win the next election. I mean, politicians have to show that they're listening to the electorate. 2/3 of the country think immigration is too high. It's costing the country an enormous sum of money. It's not bringing in the brightest and the best, which is what Britain's immigration policy has always been supposed to do. And she, at last, has got the political will to tackle it. Whether her party will let her do so is another question.
Another question. Claire, is Shabana Mahmood that rare thing a Labour Party politician the Daily Mail quite likes?
Yes, we do quite like her. I think she's sort of addressing some of the issues that people really care about. And you've obviously got a huge threat from reform if you're the Labour Party. And she's the only one who's really standing up and saying, articulating a lot of the feelings that Britain has. And I think that it's a real gamble by Labour, but it's one that may succeed if she's able to pull some of this stuff off.
Jenni said if the Labour Party allow her to do it. But the early evidence is the Labour Party rebellion, and there will be one, is much smaller than perhaps we'd expected.
Well, I think that's probably because about 100 Labour MPs are under threat of losing their seats to reform. I mean, I wrote a column on the day, 2 days after Shabana got the job, saying Shabana Mahmood's first job has got to be to end the Boris wave. And I'm amazed that actually she has been this bold. But if you look at the economics, if you look at the finances, if you look at the politics of it, there's just no question but that Britain needs action to be taken. And nobody's had the courage to do that, because in Britain there's been a feeling that this constant phrase, we're an open and tolerant country, but you cannot say we will take in anybody who chooses to come from all around the world, no matter whether they are net takers, as many of the Boris wave are, or net contributors, without it having an effect on the country.
So we've said Boris wave, Boris wave, Boris wave. Let's talk about Boris Johnson and tonight's report from the COVID inquiry. Absolutely withering about Boris Johnson. I had his former health secretary on the show earlier on, and she was saying absolutely unfair on him. What do you think?
I think the trouble with this inquiry is it's cost a fortune. It's raking over a load of things that happened a long time ago that I think most people want to forget. And the blame has kind of been scattered around. Everybody who was involved in government at the time has come in for some criticism, which is hardly surprising. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event. There was a pandemic that nobody could have really prepared for. Yes, mistakes were made. There were different decisions that could have been made, but the reality is that it was chaotic on the ground, that, politicians had to do whatever they could. Boris had to do whatever he could. Yeah. Definitely could have done a lot of things better, but Boris is Boris. This figure
Hang
of
on,
20...
no, sorry, can I come back to that? I totally and utterly disagree, because all of us were watching what was happening in Italy. My family went down to hide in the country 10 days before Boris Johnson declared lockdown, because we could see that Britain was 13 days behind. Boris Johnson was off duty for 7 or 10 days in February as this whole disaster was building up across the world. Nobody knows whether he was sorting out his divorce at the time or whether he was writing a Shakespeare book, but he wasn't attending the COBRA meetings. He wasn't being briefed. His government was not prepared for a pandemic. And even once it began, Boris was casually going around, as you may remember, boasting about the fact that he was shaking hands with COVID sufferers. Now, he was being absolutely ludicrous because he wasn't listening to the science, and he was doing what Boris Johnson has always done, which is not take serious situations seriously and wait for somebody else to take charge.
But the 23,000, the number that's in my head from the report tonight is 23,000 lives might have been saved if we had locked down earlier. That's what they say. And that is really kind of a wrenching thought. On the other hand, if you look at that, that's based on the modelling, and all the modelling suggested a much, much bigger number of deaths than actually took place. So in other words, they were dealing with very, very poor information at the time.
Well, of course, everyone was at the time. It was an unknown virus. But the one thing that was becoming apparent, the early evidence that was coming out of China and Hong Kong, scientists were already modelling, because I was reading it before lockdown was declared, about how if you were sitting in a restaurant where Claire is and you were sitting here and there's a barrier between, then the trails were infecting you within 48 hours. So the evidence was there, it was online, and the government was not paying attention because Boris Johnson is not a man for details. He's an optimist. He doesn't take data seriously, and his government modelled himself on that.
Let's come back to the current government and what's lying ahead of us next week, which is, of course, the budget. We have had the most extraordinary pre-budget period. I can't remember anything remotely like it, where the Chancellor comes out and more or less says, I'm going to break the manifesto and raise income tax, and then says, no, I'm not. Just your reactions to, the run-up to this budget. It's utterly chaotic, Claire, first of all.
I mean, we watched Rachel Reeves stand up in Downing Street and prepare the nation for tax rises. And then what the FT break a few days later and say, this isn't happening anymore. And it was just one of the most extraordinary events, to kind of make that claim and set out that idea and then just completely row back on it.
They weren't responsible for the leak, of course. I think what was meant to happen was that Rachel Reeves would stand up and give her budget speech and then at the crucial moment say, and therefore I can announce that I am not going to be raising income tax. That was what was meant to happen, but the leak completely pulled the rug from under that, and the markets really hated it.
I don't think it's just the markets. I mean, every single person I know who has any kind of business interest or is planning to make a big purchase or move house or employ some new people, everyone is paralysed because there have been so many different leaks about what might happen in the budget.
The entire economy has kind of gone...
has stopped.
Yeah.
I mean, there could not be a worse outcome for a country that's supposed to be concentrating on growth than leaking that any kind of tax may happen in any sector, and so nobody wants to take any action.
I don't think we should have budgets at all, because actually this has been worse, but lots and lots of budgets. You get lots of leaks, lots of speculation, and business confidence just freezes for weeks or possibly months ahead of time. I think we'll do badly out of it.
I think that's probably true, but of course this is particularly bad because, as Claire says, we were all led up one hill only to march down again the following day. So now the markets have no faith in anything that the government is promising or hinting that it's going to do.
Let's talk a little bit about Keir Starmer, because I know you're both huge enthusiasts. There's been a lot of speculation last week, and it's carried on a little bit this week, that there will be a leadership challenge, and you can see people in cabinet starting to manoeuvre and brief and so forth, and little groups forming inside the PLP. What do we both think? Does he make it through Christmas? Does he make it through the next year as well?
Well, as we know, the Labour Party is famously very, very bad at getting rid of its leaders and almost never does so in office, as far as I know. And so I think the problem is that Keir Starmer is completely useless. I thought he was useless when he became leader. He was useless before he became leader.
Tell us what you really think, Jenni. Go on.
Well, I'll tell you what I really think. I went to see him speak at a Labour Party conference soon after he'd been elected because people were already then saying, aren't we lucky?
Yeah.
Fantastic brain, DPP, he's going to be a great leader. And he looked like a frightened rabbit.
We're out of time, I'm afraid, both of you. So sorry about that, Claire. I do apologise, Claire. Thank you both, Claire and Jenni. Thank you both very much indeed. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order you would like them. Pause, rewind live radio, listen to a range of podcasts. Download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew.
To set
centuries, yet the government intends to curtail that right in order to reduce the clogging up of our courts. Is this a fundamental attack on our rights?